Hello, my name is Kendra Park. I'm a junior at Bloomsburg University. I'm a dual major in mass communications and political science. For my presentation today, I did a comparative study of global human rights. I chose this topic because I know that among lots of countries there are numerous human rights issues, and I wanted to compare developing countries with developed countries. So an outline includes, I'll be discussing global human rights, the definition, organizations, then developing countries, Afghanistan, Mexico, and Vietnam, and then the developed countries, Australia, Japan, and the United States. So the definition is human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. These rights are all interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible. So, some global human rights organizations, NGOs, Amnesty International, Children's Defense Fund, Human Rights Action Center, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Without Frontiers, National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, and Simon Wiesenthal Center. Then for international or intergovernmental and government organizations, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Human Rights Council, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, U.S. Department Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Office of Democratic Institutions, and Human Rights of the Organization for Security and Cooperative in Europe. Global human rights organizations, human rights commissions, Commissions for Human Rights, Council of Europe, European Union Ombudsman, European Commission Directorate for Employment, Social Affairs, and Equal Opportunities, African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and the Asian Human Rights Commission. So for developing countries, I'm going to discuss Afghanistan, Mexico, and Vietnam. For each country, I wrote down numerous issues that they have, as well as how the country looks at human rights from their constitution. I'll be giving examples of just some of the issues. So for Afghanistan, there is child labor laws, women's rights, arbitrary detention, torture, and discriminatory practices, freedom of expression, armed conflict, and death penalty. So, just some examples. For children and labor laws. Poverty forces children to work and sacrifice their chance at an education. Thousands of children are forced to start working at the age of 5. Various sources state that between 21 and 25% of Afghan children are part of the labor force. There are numerous health risks that the children are exposed to while conducting unsafe work. Child labor is hard to overcome in Afghanistan because even though it is illegal by law for anyone under the age of 14 to work, families are so desperate that they need one of their children to work so that they can live. Employers are desperate for workers that will work cheap. The government appears to be doing little to enforce this law. A common job for Afghan children in Kabul is working in brick factories. The children can work up to 12 hours for about $140 a day. Other jobs for children include working in bakeries, weaving, selling toilet paper and shopping bags, mining, washing cars, or farming. If Afghan children are working, they are missing out on crucial developmental steps. A work environment could replace play and stimulate a child's brain, but it is not certain if the children are gaining the right type of knowledge that they would gain from play. The stress children suffer when working will also cause other stunted developmental issues. Then for freedom of expression, in January 2016, a suicide attack on a minibus in Kabul killed 7 journalists associated with Tolo, one of the largest national media outlets. The Taliban claimed responsibility for the attack, which it described in a statement as revenge for false allegations made against the rebel group. Next is Mexico. Some other issues include torture, extrajudicial killings, and summary executions, police repression, sexual murder, news reporter assassinations, criminal justice system, freedom of media, women's and girls' rights, and disability rights. Some examples. For torture. Torture is commonly practiced in Mexico to obtain confessions and extract information. Common torture methods include beatings, waterboarding, electric shocks, and sexual abuse. Despite a constitutional ban on using evidence retrieved through torture, some judges continue to ignore torture complaints and accept allegedly forced confessions. Then for the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system regularly fails to offer justice to victims of violent crimes and human rights violations. Reasons of failure include corruption, inadequate training and resources, and complicity of prosecutors and public defenders with criminals and abusive officials. The failure of law enforcement has added to the development of armed citizen self-defense groups in numerous areas of the country. Then for women's and girls' rights. Mexican laws do not effectively protect women and girls against domestic and sexual violence. Some provisions, including those that make the severity of punishments for some sexual offenses reliant upon the chastity of the victim, which contradict international principles. And then under disability rights, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in a 2014 report discovered that despite new laws and programs protecting the rights of the disabled, severe gaps remained, including in access to justice, legal standing and the right to vote, access to buildings, transportation, and public spaces, violence against women, and education. In 2015, Disability Rights International stated that Mexican women with psychological disabilities were at great risk of being rejected reproductive rights. State-run clinics in Mexico City occasionally pressure women into being sterilized or, when pregnant, getting an abortion, and that environments were inhumane in Mexico City's government-funded facilities for people with disabilities, including one institution that locked children in cages. Now, for Vietnam, issues include freedom of speech and opinion, freedoms of assembly, association, and movement, freedom of religion, police, torture, and criminal justice system. So examples include freedom of speech and opinion. The Vietnamese government regularly uses ambiguously worded penal code provisions to clamp down on opposition, including undermining national unity, conducting propaganda against the state, and abusing the rights to democracy and freedom to infringe upon the interests of the state. In 2016, at least 19 bloggers and activists were put on trial and sentenced. Then under freedoms of assembly, association, and movement. Vietnam prohibits all independent political parties, labor unions, and human rights organizations. Authorities demand official approval for public gatherings and refuse to grant permission for meetings, marches, or protests they consider politically or otherwise unacceptable. Limitations on freedom of movement are used to block bloggers and activists from going to public events such as protest, human rights discussions, and trials of fellow activists. Then for freedom of religion, the government monitors, harasses, and occasionally aggressively cracks down on religious groups that operate outside official government-registered and government-controlled religious institutions. Then moving on to developed countries, Australia, Japan, and the United States. For Australia, issues include asylum seekers and refugees, disability rights, overly broad counterterrorism laws, Indigenous Australians' overrepresentation in prison, and sexual orientation and gender identity. Under asylum seekers and refugees. Since 2013, everyone seized arriving by boat and looking for asylum in Australia has been sent to Manus Island or Nauru. More than 900 asylum seekers and refugees lived on Manus Island and about 1,200 on Nauru. In Nauru, refugees and asylum seekers frequently suffered violence, threats, and harassment from Nauruans, with little protection from local authorities. In 2016, The Guardian newspaper printed more than 2,000 leaked documents that uncovered widespread and systematic abuse, largely of children at the Nauru Detention Center. Then under disability rights, women and girls with disabilities in Australia are predominantly in danger of sexual violence. Some even face forced sterilization and involuntary psychiatric interventions. People with disabilities are overrepresented in prisons and are more likely to be investigated, charged, incarcerated, and serve lengthier prison sentences compared to people without disabilities. People with disabilities have been deteriorating in prisons for years without having been convicted of a crime simply because the government has not provided alternatives to imprisonment. Then for Japan, human rights issues include refugees and asylum seekers, sexual orientation and gender identity, death penalty, discrimination of ethnic minorities, violence against women and girls, the justice system, and freedom of assembly. Some examples include sexual orientation and gender identity. The Japanese law recognizes people requesting legal recognition as transgender as having a gender identity disorder and requires attaining such medical diagnosis. And for death penalty, death row inmates have insufficient access to legal counsel and only being informed of their execution on the day it is to take place. Next, for the United States, sexual orientation, gender identity, violence against women, prison conditions, death penalty, and gun violence. Some examples of sexual orientation and gender identity. State legislators have presented a record number of bills looking to confine the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. North Carolina removed local non-discrimination protections for sexual orientation and gender identity and demanded transgender people to use public facilities that correspond to the sex given to them at birth. Mississippi passed a law allowing religious believers to discriminate against LGBT people and unmarried couples. Tennessee passed legislation permitting counselors and therapists to reject to work with LGBT clients. Transgender women in immigration detention have been exposed to sexual assault and ill treatment. Then for violence against women, an estimated 32% of women in the United States have suffered from physical violence by an intimate partner, and roughly 19% have been raped, with almost half of these committed by an intimate partner. Then here is my works cited for this whole presentation. Throughout this presentation, you can see that it doesn't matter if it's a developed country or a developing country, countries have the same issues. And, I don't know what exactly they need to do in order to fix these issues. I'm sure different methods would work in different countries, but it's obvious that these issues need to be addressed so that people can, feel that they have their human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.